Hello, everyone. Today I'm talking with Katie Kernodle about what is happening in the mental health profession. And those of you who might be familiar with just how far off the rails the mental health profession has gone, I think will even those of you who know that will be very shocked to even hear what we're going to be talking about today and what Katie will be presenting to us today. So Katie, thank you for joining me. I've been looking forward to having this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. You wrote an essay on your Substack about 2 months ago. And what I'm going to do just real quick, I'm just going to bring up the title of it here real quick. Searing Bullets and Bloodstained Knives, Liberation and Decolonial Psychologies in the Material Turn. So, first of all, like right off the bat, this is pointing to some very serious stuff, right? It's pointing to violence. It's pointing to liberation and decolonial psychologies that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about, most of our discussion here today in the material turn. So there's like this, even just the title itself is just jam packed with what's going on. But I just wanted to throw that up there quick to show that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link to that to your Substack in the description, so that people can go directly to that article and read it themselves. I highly recommend everybody reads this article, especially after what you're going to hear.
Yeah, and the title, that's a direct quote from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. A lot of people are going to be familiar with that, and we'll talk a little bit more about Frantz Fanon and like decolonialism, post-colonialism, things like that. But like I thought that it really captured just the essence of the seriousness of these practices.
No doubt, for sure. And you really outline why that is, in your essay. So I guess before we get started, if you don't mind, maybe giving a little bit of background on how you came to know about this and what your involvement is in the mental health field.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Katie Kernodle. Most people watching this are probably going to be more familiar with my name online, which is The Kids Are Not All Right. So I've been publishing under that name for approximately 3 years, mostly on Substack, and primarily about education, but also about counseling, like religion, anywhere where critical consciousness and the sort of Marxist theology has infiltrated. That's kind of been my focus. I have a license, so I have a temporary associate license in for counseling in the state of Arizona. I'm just waiting for my exam scores to process through the state to get the full license. So that's just all I'm waiting on at this point. And then I'll be returning to clinical practice. I have a master's degree from NYU in counseling, and that's kind of what led me down this path, because as one might expect, it was a particularly radical program. It was actually a decolonized program, which at the time I had no idea. But it sort of introduced me to things like Paulo Freire, kind of fell into new discourses and learning about Paulo Freire and critical pedagogy through that. And pretty much since then, it's been a huge research focus because it's so important. I think we're living in Paulo Freire's world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and like liberation theology in general, because liberation psychology does come primarily from liberation theology, which is also the same sort of line of thought that Freire comes from. But yeah.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, and I think something that's really important for people to know is, like, not only do you have, the experience that you just outlined, in the mental health field, but you also have a solid understanding of, I guess, I'll just refer to it as this woke ideology. You referred to critical consciousness before, and Paulo Freire and some of these other names that will kind of we'll talk about further as we go along. But
Yeah, if
you
I could
have.
just add.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm so
Absolutely.
sorry.
No,
I
go
just want
ahead.
to
Go
add
ahead.
something that I forgot because I do have another master's degree in international security, which is oriented, I think, like it's a little bit more towards like comparative politics and history and things like that. But there is an element of religion and particularly like radical Islam and things like that, or Islamism, some people would call it. But yeah, just I wanted to add that because I think it does add a
Yes, for
little bit of a
sure.
context in terms of all of this.
For sure. And just with that, the main things I want to point out is not only do you know what you're talking about and have experience in the field, but you also understand the ideology behind the ideology, not only the ideology and the language that's used behind what you're presenting today, and how how it fits in with what's going on in the in the mental health profession, and then also having the courage to speak up and raise awareness about this. I mean, there's very few people around, period, that have all of those attributes, and we're very lucky to have you be able to kind of explain this stuff to us and raise awareness about it. So definitely appreciate that.
Yeah.
So like I said, I want to focus on because there's so much to talk about, but I want to focus on what you laid out in your essay, because I know you spent a lot of time on it, and there's a lot of really important information that people need to be aware of in that. So kind of the first thing that you kind of laid out in it was this, I guess it was an article in one of the psychology journals that kind of like started to kind of raise some of the red flags for you and stuff like that. What was that, and just generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So, excuse me. This is in the American Psychologist. So that is the American Psychological Association's flagship journal. It was by Dr. Tama Bryant, who she was the 2023 APA president, and she's also a tenure professor at Pepperdine University. And she's also a minister in the AME, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So she, kind of combines this I'd say like American, maybe like conist Black liberation theology, like specifically. But I was basically like flipping through the American Psychologist, and this was the first article. It was a presidential paper, and it was called Lessons from Decolonial and Liberation Psychologies for the Field of Trauma Psychology. So it was focused specifically on trauma. And just reading the abstract, I was just immediately struck by how radical it was. It wasn't as hidden behind language as maybe like other things would be in the past. And she talked about how these kinds of psychologies, and this is really important. So when I'm referring to these psychologies, like these are revolutionary practices. So I'm using the word psychologies because that's how they use it, but like I don't think it meets the definition of a psychology with that, how people would understand that word. So when I say psychology is in this context, it's revolutionary practices. So praxis, that kind of thing.
Okay, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I wasn't making that connection specifically, but that's good. Okay.
Yeah. And so she talked about how these psychologies, quote, awakened her to, quote, conceptualizations and frameworks that center reclamation as a form of holistic healing and empowerment for trauma. And then she cited socio-political pathways for survivors to, quote, reclaim themselves. So in the context of things like Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, Paulo Freire, like all of this background that's included in liberation and decolonial psychologies, there are really serious implications just in that little sentence that I read. So these like are basically revolutionary practices that are ultimately and foundationally oriented towards violent struggle. I mean, that's always a part of these sort of revolutionary practices. It's always on the table. And at least in like certain contexts, like Fanon, he thinks that it's absolutely necessary. There's no way around it. And that's like a core part of his ideology. So basically it's saying that like going and doing revolutionary activism up to and including, really serious things, is freeing. It's sort of like reclaiming one's wholeness in this sort of like, so I guess it is like a little bit of a like playing with the language, so like the average person, like let's say the average clinician reading this, it would not necessarily set off alarm bells. But when if you've read Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and you know what like reclaiming, holistic healing and stuff like that means, there are really serious, like violent implications underneath that. So when I read that, it was just like, okay, I have to figure out how to communicate this to other people urgently. This was in like late 2024, I'd say fall. Because this is obviously going to be a central thing. And in the title of my piece, I specifically included liberation and decolonial psychologies in the material turn, because I think that context that we're in right now, I'd say maybe like 2024 to 2026 is kind of this frame that I'm looking at. I think that is really important to understand. So the material turn is basically sort of a like moving past what we might consider to be like it is still woke, but like sometimes I characterize it as post woke because people really think of woke as a very specific thing, like DEI trainings and
Sure.
blue hair activists and that kind of thing. But it's sort of moving past like the identity politics basically, and more towards the grounding and like material struggle. So economic class struggle, class identity, sustainability, like nationalism, so like blood and soil nationalism versus immigration, like that kind of thing. So in that particular context, these practices, these revolutionary practices, liberation and decolonial psychologies, become very serious because we're talking about grounding in class struggle, things like nationalism, and I think the nature of those types of issues, because they're so tangible, it's about food on the table and like really everyday kinds of things. I think they are a little bit more like volatile in the class struggle kind of sense, with more violence and things like that.
Sure. Let me I just want to come back to the word liberation just for a second, because like when I would think generally, unless you're kind of in tune with this liberationist ideology type of thing, which plays into all these other things, theology, psychology, all these other things, unless you're kind of in tune with that and what that means, and read some of the stuff that you've been talking about, like people generally have a positive connotation to the word liberation, right? It sounds like, okay, this is something good, right? Kind of like the play on words with diversity and equity and inclusion and things like that. Generally speaking, people hear these words for the first time, and alarm bells aren't really necessarily going off, right? So, and I know you touched on it, somewhat just now with what you were saying, but just like getting into the liberation paradigm, what are the concerns that people should be thinking about versus just thinking, it's something that freeing a country from, let's say, an invading country, or just the general thing, even as ridiculous as it is, like President Trump had the Liberation Day on tariffs a couple weeks ago, right? And so it's just something that people think of generally in a positive sense.
Yeah, and I think that's also like why I'm trying to emphasize like in this context. So when I like, for example, when I read that abstract, I had all this background context to help me make sense of it. But if you didn't have that, you wouldn't necessarily know. And that's like a really important thing. So liberation in this really specific context means liberation from these intersecting systems of oppression. So racism, sexism, heteronormativity, etc. And because all of these systems are interconnected with one another, like these intersectional systems, you could, like, if you're targeting racism, you're trying to overcome racism, well, sexism and heteronormativity and capitalism are like all dragged in that because they're all connected. It's all one thing. So it's basically it's revolution, like liberation is literally communist revolution. freedom from these, various systems of oppression towards communist ends, communist being stateless, classless utopia. And utopia literally means nowhere, like no place. So it's this sort of like perfected horizon, like on the, in the future kind of thing that's like projected out. So it does not mean just, in like the positive sense of like freedom.
So
like freedom from reality.
Okay, I see what you're saying, right? But in terms of, so it's freedom from either a real or perceived oppression. Let's say, and in this case, the people who have adopted this worldview or this ideology see basically Western civilization, or certainly America, as the oppression that they are trying to liberate themselves and, let's say, society from. So so the liberation that they're trying to liberate themselves from Western civilization, from America.
From like the American Constitution. Yeah, it's
right. All right. Exactly. Okay. So
and from the boundaries. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut
go
you
ahead.
off.
No, go ahead.
Like when I said like freedom from reality, because like they want freedom from, the fact that like we aren't our own creators, that we literally don't create ourselves. And the fact that we have all of these things that we have to do. We have to work to eat. Like we have to do all of these things that we don't necessarily want to do, but they're just like facts of life. Like that's like liberation from those things. So it's very destructive.
Liberation from anything that they that they don't like or so. I mean, to some extent, right? All right. So I guess something I'd like to ask you about too is like how you outline kind of where this liberation theology kind of came from, type of thing, in terms of like it seemed to essentially kind of come out of Latin America, and there was some kind of some religious underpinnings that kind of fed into that as well.
Okay, so liberation theology is a contextualized theology, which means because think about it in like the postmodern sense, like things arise from their time and space-bound contexts. So you have you have American liberation theology in the form of James Cone, for example. So there are different so the proper way of saying this would be liberation theologies. But most people, when they talk about liberation theology, they're talking about Latin American liberation theology, which is the primary one where it came out of. So in the piece, I like really briefly just touched on Vatican II. I understand like this is a little bit of a controversial subject for a lot of people, and I want to emphasize that like I'm neither anti-Vatican II or anti-Catholic. I don't know enough to be making those judgments. But Vatican II basically, it was from 1962 to 1965, and basically just changed the Catholic Church in very significant ways. But among them was sort of a decentralization and like empowerment of the laity. And that specifically is sort of what allowed these Latin American bishops to have this, to be able to do like this contextual theology and like practice in Latin America under the banner of the Catholic Church. So I think like a lot of Catholics would 100% consider this heresy. I think it's been judged heresy by the various formal mechanisms that they have in the Catholic Church. But still, even with that, because of the way that things were decentralized, it allowed it to kind of develop in the context of Latin America. So in 1968, they had the Second Episcopal Conference of Latin America. This is also often called the Medellin Conference. So that's where these Catholic bishops got together and sort of responded to Vatican II in the Latin American context. And this is where a lot of liberation theology sort of developed. They sort of took like a dialectical materialist frame for economic issues. So, they talk about structural injustice and like structural sin, for example. So whenever you see structural sin, especially in maybe like Christian educational or counseling contexts, like red flag, because that
Okay.
is referring to like, basically systemic injustice, that kind of thing. Um, but it's the idea is that it's salvation from the consequences of sin are demanded within imminent reality. So that is like very, I'd say very unorthodox, like arguably heresy in the context of what most people call Orthodox Christianity. Um, so I have this quote, if I can find it here. Um, oh yeah, so all men and all peoples, and this is from the document produced by this conference, all men and all peoples ought to feel collectively culpable, commit themselves to conquer the sin within, and fight for liberation from sin's consequences. And then parentheses, that includes hunger, misery, sickness, oppression, and ignorance. Um, so if you think about that, they're talking about like the kingdom of God in imminent, like here and now reality. We're not talking about this heavenly realm, not of this world. We're talking about in
Okay.
this world liberation. Um,
Okay.
the
Right.
and they also, I think in this conference they approved something called Christian-based communities, which are very popular throughout the third world, really, but especially in Latin America, but also Africa, where they were actually using a lot of times Paulo Freire's literacy, like consciousness raising method to do Bible study, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. So I'm kind of just going through a timeline here.
Yep. Sure.
But these are basically autonomous groups of laity that do Bible studies, but also like consciousness raise, like radicalize. So learning to read the Bible and read their political situation and like go do activism, like resist it. So like we're talking about primarily illiterate, rural kind of people. Maybe they don't have like a local church that can serve them. So we're like very like no, I don't want to say disorganized, but like it's not centralized, like dispersed in that way. So like dispersed grassroots kind of radicalization under the guise of Catholicism, very little control from like what most people would consider to be like the capital C Catholic Church.
Okay. Okay.
And then really just briefly, and we can kind of get into this a little bit later, but the primary I guess you could say theologian, like developer of this, is named Gustavo Gutierrez. He was a theologian from Peru. He was also a priest. I think he was a Dominican priest. He went to, I think it was Belgium and France, and that's kind of where he was introduced to people like Freud, Karl Marx, etc., and like brought these ideas back with him to sort of develop this liberation theology. But like he very openly adopts Marx's dialectical theory of class struggle and like on the material conditions of poverty, and like takes that. Think of it like they think of it like an analytical tool. So they're not adopting Marx's ends, but just his like means, which like should sound kind of familiar in a lot of other contexts right now.
Sure.
And he wrote that book in 1971. So that's just like basically we're talking 60s, 70s, maybe a little bit at like early 80s. That's kind of the time frame in Latin America. And if people are familiar with, sort of like the political and social situation in Latin America, it was it was rough, we're talking about legitimate oppression, legitimate fascism. I think for example, Pope Francis was from Argentina. And, we're talking a time frame where like something like 15 to 30,000 people were disappeared by like, the dictators. You're talking about like nuns getting taken on helicopter rides and thrown out over the ocean, like really rough things, a lot of social, material instability. So this is kind of like the context where all of this comes from.
Okay. So you mentioned Paulo Freire, and so I guess it would kind of be a good time maybe to kind of segue into his role and maybe what he picked up from the liberation theology and how kind of maybe move that into education. Is that,
Absolutely.
and you talked about the critical consciousness and developing that lens, that worldview in people. I think obviously Paulo Freire has been the you mentioned we're living in Paulo Freire's world, right? This is, and those of us who've been, kind of trying to raise awareness in the education space, we know his impact in education.
Yeah. So fortunately, a lot more people are learning about Paulo Freire, and I say that as like I also just, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I learned about this. I learned about it through new discourses and James's Marxification of Education. Highly recommend. But he is just such a foundational figure in so many different ways. He was a Brazilian educator from Recife, and he basically created a method of, like, a literacy method that simultaneously raised political consciousness. So like learning to read the word to read the world, so like by teaching, let's say, like rural, illiterate peasants how to read, he was also like simultaneously trying to teach them how to read their political situation and take action against it. Of course, like the actual literacy didn't happen, like generally doesn't happen. I mean, I think they did a study on this, and like it caused so much emotional distress, just the process of it, that I don't think the actual like real literacy part occurred. But
I'm sorry, just for a second there, does that kind of relates to the kind of the generative themes, let's say, model, kind of feeds into that, for those who are familiar with that, basically using topics that teachers are supposed to be teaching kids in school to then take them on a tangent to talk about social, economic, cultural issues that are completely, let's say, unrelated to the lesson that was supposed to be taught, so that they can raise this critical consciousness in the students or whoever they're presenting to.
Yeah, so like in this context, it would be favela, suffering, hunger, like those kinds of words, would be like the jumping off point for the socio-political like literacy. But basically, like it's called the See, Judge, Act hermeneutical method. Hermeneutical is like an interpretive method, usually like talking specifically about the Bible, but not exclusively. Which, by the way, side note, just real quick, that's the foundational pastoral method of Laudato Si, which is like it was an encyclical by Pope Francis. I wrote about this in my piece on eco-theology quite extensively, actually. So I mean, maybe I'll reshare that, or we can link it or something.
Absolutely.
But it's the same See, Judge, Act hermeneutical method. That's the foundational pastoral method of that. But he took that from the radical Catholic workers movement. I think they're also called the Josists, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Jocist, Josists.
Do you mind?
Oh, sorry.
I mean, maybe this is where you're headed, but do you mind kind of like explaining that See, Judge, Act process? That's probably where you were heading. I didn't mean to jump in there, but I just wanted to make sure we didn't get too far before.
Yeah. So this, and like it's useful because like the See, Judge, Act was literally just sort of transposed into this critical consciousness like method. So a lot of people might already sort of like just naturally be familiar with it without realizing, but it's like in the sense of political literacy, like seeing injustice, judging it, like that's so like in the Freirean sense, learning to read your political situation, like assessing that that's something that needs to change, so like critique basically, and act, and then reflecting on it and doing it again.
That reminds me of basically the three main points of critical theory, if I remember correctly, from what James Lindsay presented, from what I understood James Lindsay to present on his new discourses, things on critical theory, basically seeing how the world is, judging it critically, and then taking up activism to change that world in that paradigm, in that worldview.
Oh, wow. Okay. I actually wasn't familiar with like maybe that specific lecture or episode or something, and maybe I've listened to it. So that's really, really helpful. Yeah,
I hope I'm remembering that correctly. I'm pretty sure I am, but yeah, it seems like it kind of dovetails right in almost perfectly. But Go ahead.
Yeah. So literally, like, so exactly what Paul just said. This See Judge Act hermeneutical method. So like when I'm talking here about interpretation, I'm talking about interpreting the world. So like treating the world like it's like a text, that you're reading and analyzing in like this sort of postmodern, I guess you could say, sense, versus like sort of a engagement with reality on like equal terms, or like treating it like it's a story that needs to be interpreted like the Bible, instead of how most people would like perceive reality in like a very normal sense.
Okay.
So anytime you hear me talk about critical consciousness or conscientization, this is the process that I'm talking about. And this is so important because it's foundational in it's foundational in education. It's foundational in a lot of like pastoral and religious contexts right now. And it's foundational in liberation and decolonial psychologies. So like we're talking, this is absolutely central to understand. If you can only understand one thing, it's this critical consciousness. And it's basically, like I said, just an awareness of your political context and the motivation and the agency to change it. And this is also like something really important that I think it's missed a little bit, is that when people are talking about like being woke, or like critical consciousness being like awakened woke to these systems of power, there's also this action component that cannot be uncoupled from it. So like the activism is built into this worldview. Basically, it's a cult worldview. Logan Lansing has talked extensively about how this was kind of codified more by Joe Kinchlow as critical constructivist epistemology. I won't really get into that because we've got a lot kind of going, but I think that's something that people should probably look into because it has been codified. So all of this has been brought into the United States through a variety of different methods. Like Henry Giroux would be a major figure that sort of brought Freire into the United States education, culturally relevant teaching, things like that. But in the context of liberation, I'll stop there because I want to be able to get into a little about liberation theology before I go to liberation psychology, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. If you have something in your mind that you want to head towards, that's fine. At some point, I just wanted to touch. I know you mentioned briefly some tie-ins with Black liberation theology and Islamic liberation theology as kind of pieces to at least be aware of. But that's go ahead.
Yeah, so because I think this is really important for a variety of different contexts, is understanding liberation theology. So when most people think of the word theology, they're thinking the study of God either through reason, or like faith, like prayer, things like that. Like I'm thinking of like, in Eastern Orthodoxy, the theologian is the one who prays, like that kind of thing. It is neither one of these things. It is revolutionary practice. It is, as Gustavo Gutierrez defined it, it is a critical reflection on praxis. So it's basically what we just talked about with Freire. Also, just really briefly.
So if I think of it as basically a religion of revolution, is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's Marxism.
Well, there you go. Okay, right. Okay. Gotcha. Go ahead.
But just really quickly, the first person to pick up Freire's conscientization method was, because he was in Recife, was the Red Bishop of Recife, Dom Helder Camara, who was the mentor of Klaus Schwab. So just a quick little side note on that. But yeah, like like this is Marxism, guys. Like it has a little bit of a Christian coding, I guess you could call it. And like I think there's a case maybe that like Marxism is like a Christian heresy first. Like if and this is like going to get like way too in the weeds, but like going back to like Hegel and these sort of like Swabian pietists and things like that like all of this kind of stuff, because it has that sort of like little tiny bit of deformed Christian basis, that like it's really easy for it to kind of readapt in this context and like just kind of slip right in, because it has some of the I don't want to say the same themes, but there's elements that allow that to happen.
Okay.
But it's, rather than like doctrinal truths, like they would say like doctrinal truths created by the intelligentsia, like that kind of thing, rather than that, like what most people would think of as theology. We're talking about reflection on actions to end human suffering. We're talking about revolutionary practice, like praxis, with like a little, like they would say in light of God's word, so like using the Bible or using like these, certain themes, like for example, Exodus, or like viewing like Jesus Christ liberator, that kind of thing. They will quote, for example, I think it's somewhere in Jeremiah, that to know God is to do justice. So know God, like the study of theology, is to do justice, in this context, revolutionary activism.
So they're picking and choosing certain aspects, co-opting things, have grains of truth in some of their stuff, but they're twisting it for their own ends. Okay.
Yeah, and like here it's a process based. So constantly like doing praxis, reflecting on it, doing it again, just sort of like moving the needle closer to what they would call the kingdom of heaven. But this is an imminent reality. So really it's communism, because communism is the kingdom of heaven brought into the here and now, like the real world. And so the highest form of knowing is like doing that. So that's what I mean by theology. And that's what I mean by like a liberation theologian. It's not how most people would think. And like, it's like similar to why I was saying that I'm comfortable using the word psychology. Same with like theology, because it has that logos part that's not actually in this. Is like anti-logos, basically.
Wow.
So
okay,
it's like a misnomer. It's like inverted, which is something that they do.
sure.
But it takes all of the same things. So like the principal means of salvation is being on the side of the oppressed. So adopting this Maoist like people standpoint and doing activism on their behalf. And that is like what it means to be a Christian. So like, for example, Leonardo Boff, who's like a major liberation theologian, who would say it's not those who are Christians who are good, true, and just, rather the good, the true, and the just are Christians. So you see how they kind of flip it, and it's about like action, praxis, things like that. They also have something they would call like a feet on the ground theology. So this comes from Clodovis Boff, who spent a lot of time doing pastoral work in like the Amazonian jungle, and just sort of thought about it in the sense of like doing work, like this really rigorous, painful, difficult, suffering kind of experience alongside the oppressed. That is like part of like studying God, like doing that. So like it's almost like the philosophy of Gulag, being re-educated through really difficult, hard labor. And then they would perceive the like the quote unquote oppressed, which I think like anytime you see the oppressed, just insert in this context proletariat, that they're like, they would call them the scourged Christ. So whoever is being oppressed at any given time and place, that is who you have to be on the side of, like, and move towards revolution. So like it is very Marxist in that sense.
Okay.
So hopefully that helps kind of explain, because I understand that it's very difficult to like fully, like liberation theology is so important, but it's so slippery. So hopefully that kind of helps pin it down a little bit, even though it's always kind of moving.
Yeah, and I mean, and just how like I don't know what the best words I mean, how kind of like sneaky and also like obviously subversive and insane that it is, and that's why like that's why more people have to know about your work and what you're trying to raise awareness about. I mean, I know some others are doing it as well, but like you're really doing a lot of work on this, and it's and people can learn a lot from what you're presenting. So where do you, to get into like the psychology of liberation next type of thing, is that kind of like where this heads next?
Yeah, I can do that. Did you want me to talk at all? I can do it just like super briefly, because I actually don't know as much like to really be able to talk about it the way I can talk about other things, like the Black
That's
liberation
fine.
theology. So just some like a name to be aware of is James Cone, really prominent like Black liberation theologian. I think he was a Methodist minister. He was known for let's see here, like declaring that that white theology of mainstream Christianity was that of the Antichrist. It's the same.
Okay.
It's the same themes, just in this like
Yes.
particular context. I like bring him up specifically because this is kind of the I'd say like the realm probably that like someone like Dr. Tama Bryant, who's an AME minister and like more involved in this like American Black liberation theology, is going to be pulling from. But it's all kind of like blended together, and it's all quite similar. And then just really briefly, because this is something like Islamic liberation psychology is a thing, and it is like almost certainly being practiced like in various contexts in the United States right now, which is very, very,
Yes.
very concerning.
Yes.
But in the piece, I just really briefly touched on Ali Shariati and Syed Qutb. So Ali Shariati was like the intellectual father of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Of course, as soon as the revolution was brought to pass, they just got like all the revolutionaries got like discarded by the Ayatollah, and they just implemented like a just a regular theocracy. But they still use a lot of these practices, like in like the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and like Quds, and like all these like trying to destabilize, but like especially parts of the Gulf, or like places where there's like a Shia minority. So like for those that aren't familiar, this would be Shiism, and like Shiism in Islam is the very small minority. It goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, and like I think that they think that it like the successorship should have stayed in his family to go to Ali, whereas Sunnis, it went to like Abu Bakr, who was like a close person of it's that kind of thing. So but it's minority, so it's very easy to kind of play on these liberation themes of oppression, because like they very often are like an oppressed minority in a lot of contexts. But like Jean-Paul Sartre said, if I have no religion, but if I were to choose one, it would be that of Shariati's. So we're talking about just another kind of iteration of Marxism. He like used something called red Shiism. So he like his sort of like revolutionary red Shiism was sort of compared to black Shiism of like the clerics, and sort of like what they would call like more of like a in the context of liberation theology, like black Shiism would be like the Latin American Catholic Church, like sort of like the dominant power, that kind of thing. But it's the same kind of themes, just sort of transposed in a different context. And then Syed Qutb is really important because most people would consider him to be the political theorist of like Al Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. And he was Egyptian. He I think he was sent to like some like rural town in Colorado. I think he was sent by the monarchy of Egypt to de-radicalize him, and he just like spent the whole time just like writing about how awful everything is, and how like the music and the hairstyles and the clothing, and like we're talking about like really conservative early like 20th century
Right.
America. So it's just
Right.
it's just that kind of insanity. But most people would consider him to be like the father of Salafist like jihadism. It's like very influential over Osama bin Laden, influential in like the Muslim Brotherhood Party, things like that. So I just like mention them because that is something that is going on. We like I see it in like the academic literature, and religion is usually like considered okay to be incorporating in like psychology and counseling contexts. And so when you have Islam, and then you have like Marxist radicalism like brought together, so like we're talking about Islamism, like usually, so I know this is like a whole thing. When I use the word Islamism, I'm usually referring to like this really specific, like what I'm just talking about right now, this 20th century modern sort of like reaction to modernity from Islam. So we're talking about like it's not just an alliance, like we're talking about like using Marxist dialectical critique on the Quran, or like on the clerics and stuff like that, to sort of like infuse Marxism into the religion. So it's a little bit different than like maybe an alliance in that kind of way. But like this is kind of what I'm referring to when I refer to that.
Sure. And I think it's really important for people to be kind of aware of this because of I think as it becomes more, as it has been becoming more prominent, and will continue to, I guess, accelerate or become even, an even bigger issue in the not too distant future. So this is
Yeah.
definitely something that's on the horizon. I mean, it's already here. People already see kind of what's going on, but you're explaining kind of, the engine underneath of what's happening, and where it's heading.
Yeah.
So that's why people need to know and be aware of this. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really briefly, because like when you said the word accelerate, it just made me think like accelerate the contradictions. So like that's like, when I'm saying like this is infused Marxism, like it's using Marxist political warfare tactics. So we're talking about like accelerating the contradictions, using like dialectical political warfare, using like vanguard, like Leninist vanguard parties, like the Muslim Brotherhood. Like we're talking about like real Marxist tactics. So that's why like I think it's important to know that, and to not sort of like let it get all blended together as like it's all the same because it's all radical, or like it's all bad. Like it's not a judgment as to like when someone points that out. Like for example, like when I point that out, like I'm not making a judgment that like Islam good. I'm not like, I'm saying that this is like a very specific thing with very specific tactics that we need to be aware of. Like the martyrdom, that kind of thing. Like this is a theme, and like we'll get into this a little bit with like the psychology, or this psychology aspect, and like the here and now. But like martyrdom is a theme here. We're talking about people who genuinely believe that like you throw yourself onto this dialectical wheel of history, and like like a martyr for the revolution, that kind of thing.
Okay. And one other thing that I want to kind of highlight that you mentioned in terms of like, it's all kind of underneath. It's all kind of the same, I guess, engine, or the same things that are driving the ideology, but it's contextualized to different aspects of either cultures or religions or regions, or whatever the social conditions are. It's contextualized for that. But so once people understand kind of the basics, and I learned the basics through my investigation and learning about what was happening in education, right? So that's how that was my kind of gateway into learning the basics of what was happening, and once you understand that, it's very easy. It's not hard to then pick up and learn about a lot of these other areas, because what's underneath it is the same thing. Like like you said earlier, it's basically Marxism driving it, and it's just contextualized in different, like you said, different regions, different ways of taking that tool and using it to their own advantage to gain power. Basically, is the bottom line. All right. Are you good with moving into kind of the decolonial aspect of it? Is there more on the liberation side? I mean, I know obviously those things are connected, but
yeah. So if I could just
go
do a
ahead.
little bit on liberation psychology specifically, I'll make it as fast as possible. So
absolutely.
because that like all, and it is difficult because all of this other information is background to where like the primary founder of liberation psychology is Ignacio Martin Barro. He was a Jesuit priest, born in Spain, but lived in El Salvador, and a social psychologist. So like all of this liberation theology background is, I think, really important to be able to understand this. But basically, like liberation psychology comes out of what I just discussed, liberation theology. Also, in the 1970s, there was a crisis, and they call it the crisis in social psychology, a whole thing where the replication issues, like the concerns about like whether you can be scientifically neutral, things like that. Like that was a whole thing in the field of social psychology in the 1970s. So in the United States and like, you know, just North America and maybe like Western Europe in general, either like turn towards what we consider to be like what most people would consider to be woke. So like critical reflexivity, postmodern critical reflexivity, and like the, you know, the very like academic way. I'm thinking, for example, of like James and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose's papers, like that kind of thing.
Sure.
Or it returned maybe to like a more empirical sense. But like in Latin America, it had what's called the analectic turn. So that's ana-dialectical, and it's following Enrique Dussel, who was basically the founder of liberation philosophy, which sort of underlies all of this. And like people are going to be very like familiar with that just because it's that oppressor-oppressed, marginalized kind of worldview. So that's kind of where that comes from, at least as far as I know. But basically this analectic turn, so instead of doing what North American critical psychology or critical reflexivity and things like that did, it's basically interrogating psychology from below. So from the standpoint of the poor and the oppressed, and so the question of oppression and liberation is perceived as ontological, meaning one of being, like existence, and not epistemological, meaning one of knowledge. So, you know, we're talking about like, you know, like reality and like, you know, the way that like material reality. And that's why I think this is so relevant and like why it's being specifically pushed like by these professional organizations and things like that at this time, because I think it kind of coincides with all of these different things in terms of like a more emphasis on material reality and like class and things like that. And then it takes Marx's, you know, basically theory of man as like fundamentally social, like seriously. And so when I say that, I want people to understand that like when Marx and Marxists in general are talking about man as social, they mean it in like the deepest sense of the word. I'm not talking about like, oh, we have like social relations and like in a normal sense. I'm talking about like you are like your being is in like reality and existence, and like who you are is in your social context. And so like your social context recreates you, and then they go do activism to change the social context. But like it's like I mean it in like a really deep sense that I think is difficult for like a normal person to wrap their head around. But basically, So it's more material oriented and it's more action oriented. So I have this quote from Liberation, a book on liberation psychology published by the APA, edited by the ACA 2023 ACA president Adil Torres Rivera and Lillian Comas Diaz, who's kind of prominent in all of this kind of stuff. But they talk about, you know, the hyper development of critical reflexivity as found in European and North American critical psychology. So what most people in the United States would think of as woke was insufficient for the construction of a truly liberatory psychology. Instead, they argued, the precedent of insurgent social movements, including the armed struggle, was a necessary example of action-oriented psychologies of liberation that address themselves to the oppressive social realities of the countries concerned. So that's in a book published by the APA in reference to this analectic turn as, you know, like meeting this precedent of armed struggle as like foundational to make a change.
So I just want to make a point real quick in terms of like what you're presenting, and this is I think very important for people to understand too, is like what you're presenting. Like you're not talking about stuff that's coming from, let's say, like some fringe group of psychologists that are doing their own thing, and you know you just happen to stumble upon it, and you know and you know, whatever. I mean, you're like, this is coming from the associations. This is coming from this is coming from the top. This is coming from the center. This is coming from the main associations. You know, so I just want people to understand that you know, this isn't just like. Same thing when we go back, you know, I don't know, you know, whatever, to 2018, 2019, when people were trying to raise awareness about what was happening in the schools. And I know people were trying to raise awareness of what was happening on college campuses much earlier than that. But just talking about like the K through 12 stuff, you're trying to raise awareness about it. And, initially it was like, people think, oh, that's just that crazy teacher in that one school district in that state across the country, whatever, it's not happening here. It's not whatever. This is systemic. This is coming from the center. It's coming from the top is really probably the best way to say it. But this is centered, a centered worldview in the mental health profession, that is promoting this stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah. And that's so important to understand. Like, I mean, people, if you just go on Psychology Today or like Inclusive Therapists or like these forums or places where people advertise their services, you'll just see the craziest things. Like, but I like try not to overemphasize that, because I don't want people to think that like these are just like some crazy clinicians.
Right.
It is like we're talking about APA, ACA simultaneously pushing these. And the fact that like that, so the fact that both had like for the ACA, it was Adil Torres Rivera, who's like been a long time proponent of liberation psychology. I mean, we're talking, writing about, like the value of following Che Guevara, like back in like the early 2000s. Like he's been at this for a long time. And then for the APA, Dr. Tama Bryant, who's longtime proponent of like decolonial psychology. So the fact that both of these were, like in place in this 2023, 2024 time, that simultaneously coincides with the shift in the material turn. So for the United Nations, 2024 to 2026 is called UN 2.0. It's like a turbocharger to the Sustainable Development Goals, and like a really important goal. I mean, all of the goals are equal. I mean, they all interweave and they're all important, whatever. But like in this material turn context, which I think kind of began 2023, 2024, is goal 10, which is reducing inequalities within and between countries. So we're talking about, a focus on class and economics and things like that in countries, but also between. So like in a degrowth kind of sense, with like.
So, go ahead. I mean, taking this basically Marxist engine and applying it to the globe, basically.
Yeah, and I think this is a good segue to the decolonial side. And so because they like will really focus on the quote global south and like empower, like, so it's now the time for the global south to rise and the global north needs to be degrown. In that kind of sense, you'll see it with like a lot of the immigration and things like that. And also like these are, I separated these, just for the purposes of sort of explaining them and going through them, but like they're intertwined. I think a lot of people would consider Freire to be in like maybe like the same post-colonial sort of milieu as Fanon, but I think it just makes more sense, especially to like kind of separate them in that way.
Sure.
And I think it was the paper that we talked about at the very beginning of our discussion that I opened this with, that like liberation psychology is for like a socio-political reclamation and decolonial psychology is for a cultural reclamation. So they're like serving these dual purposes, social and political and cultural. And they're kind of like, in my mind, I sort of just see this like squeezing and kind of like pushing this dialectical wheel like faster into like the material part of it. Okay. But yeah, so just would you like me to move on to decolonial?
Whatever you feel is the next best thing to move on to. That's fine.
Yeah, and I appreciate you letting me take so much time on the liberation paradigm.
No,
it's
100%.
So
I mean, I know, and I know it's a lot for people to take in, but like this is the issue with trying to raise awareness about this. Like there is no 3-minute summary, or 10-minute or 20-minute summary that someone can give to explain this stuff. It's not a bumper sticker that's like that, or a slogan that people can just understand right away. You have to understand all of this other stuff behind it. And that is a barrier to people learning about it. But I mean, it is what it is. If people are going to have a chance to understand it, they're going to have to take some time to understand like the history of this, where it's coming from, and what's behind it. But anyway, go ahead. Absolutely.
Yeah. And like this piece that I did, it's I think somewhere between 12 and 13,000 words. And so it's not short, but like that
No,
was
right.
like me like hammering as much information as I could in as short of a, like keeping it as concise and like just every sentence having some informational analytical value. And even then, like it's still fairly long. So I think it's something that could have been like
Sure.
a full book that is just being
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
so there is just it's so much information. I understand that people don't necessarily have the time, but like, like if you only have a little bit of time, watch new discourses, like do whatever you can, even if you're in the car, like just any way of just picking up this information. Before you know it, it becomes very easy and you'll pick up on it a lot faster. And it'll help you see things so much more clearly in a way that is I think not possible unless you at least have like a solid grounding in like the informational side of things.
For sure.
Um,
And just so people watching or listening know, I'm going to put the, you've mentioned new discourses and James Lindsay's work several times and a handful, a bunch of other things as well. I'm going to put the links to this stuff in the description. So if you're not already familiar with it or whatever, you'll be able to find this stuff. I'll make it easy with the links in the description. Go ahead.
yeah. So just in terms of decolonial psychology, I'm really just going to focus on Frantz Fanon because he's the most important. So Frantz Fanon, for those that aren't aware, he was a psychiatrist from Martinique. So it's like post-colonial France. He did a lot of work on like post-colonialism, critical theory, things like that. His best known works would be The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks. One was published in the 50s, other early 60s. But basically, throughout his work, he argued that the project of colonialism is totalizing. So it's violence in the physical sense, it's violence in the psychological sense. So as a part of like the psychological violence of colonialism, you experience like alienation, loss of identity, and like a fractured sense of self. And I emphasize that.
So,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, so basically living in the West, they in a Western country, let's say broadly, they view that as just living in it. They view that as oppression, living under those conditions, and they view that oppression as violence, basically violence against them.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, they feel justified in carrying out actual violence to liberate themselves from that so-called or that perceived oppression.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so like if you notice like, talk of identity, because I mean, he's a psychiatrist, he's hammering in aspects of like Freud and things like that. But identity loss, fractured sense of self. So like all of this language is used in marketing, both to clinicians and just to regular people, as like kind of the I always get the Mott and the Bailey confused, but like the outer, like the exoteric kind of thing that like a person's going to be like, oh, a fractured sense of self. That's, and like they mean like a very completely different kind of implications in terms of like how you get a whole sense of self, because it's literally through violence. And so I went on Leslie Elliott Boyce's show, The Radical Center, and I used the phrase blood magic, that what decolonization is blood magic. And like, I mean that, and like I have like, that is the most precise term that I can use for like what this is, because it is like an initiatory, cathartic ritual rebirth, like in the blood kind of way, to negate and overcome this initial violence of colonization. And something to keep in mind in this context is that like for Fanon and just for decolonization in general, they think that both the colonizer and the colonized are both held hostage by the system. So this violence against really it's mutual violence, but like this violence that's brought about is meant to free both the colonizer or the colonized and the colonizer. So like everyone is in this framework, like no one is left out, because this is the totalizing system that psychologically impacts everyone, including those that are like participating in it. Like, and so in the context of the United States, like that would be, those who are like classic Americans, things like that. just sort of
Support
like
the
the West in
Constitution.
general. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I just have some quotes that I
Yes.
included them because like there's just no other way of kind of
No,
emphasizing
100%.
the craziness. And like this, for example, what I'm about to read you is from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. This is directly cited in the counseling literature, in the mainstream counseling literature. This was directly cited, for example, recently in the Journal for Counseling and Multicultural Development in a paper by this 2023 ACA president, Adil Torres Rivera, is directly citing this, okay?
Okay.
So decolonization is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of men by another. In a, quote, total, complete, and absolute substitution as society is turned upside down. So it's a, quote, a program of complete disorder, and the, quote, naked truth evokes searing bullets and bloodstained knives. So that's where I got my title from. He talks about it being a, quote, murderous and decisive struggle.
Explicitly violent. I mean, this is okay. I
Yeah,
mean, I
exactly.
just want to keep driving that point home because I mean that is the bottom line. I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, this like literally this section, and this is at the beginning of the book too. So like, but like this section is literally called On Violence. And like it just absolutely drives home in about 1,000 different ways that like this is it is always a violent phenomenon. That is a direct quote. Decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. And it's also really important that he emphasizes that like those who initiate decolonization from this like Fanonian, or from his perspective, have decided from the very beginning that they're going to overcome any obstacles that they will come, into contact with, like through this, quote, moving force of absolute violence, like, quote, absolute violence. So basically by participating, so it needs to be like willed from above. So like it needs to be the sort of like groundswell, grassroots, like violent uprising that's like an important part of, like the magic process. In doing that, and like this violent conflict between two opposing forces, the colonizer and the colonized, that process is freeing. So like I want you to keep this in mind, because when, for example, Dr. Tama Bryant is talking about like, how decolonial psychologies as a pathway of liberation, and, or you see this language in lots of different contexts about like healing, becoming whole again, healing a fractured sense of self, I like recovering identity, all of that stuff. Like the little subtext in there is that if it's like in this Fanonian decolonizing, context, which 9 times out of 10 it is, especially right now, it has this blood magic aspect where like part of that is doing, violence. And so like, for example, that paper that I mentioned at the beginning, she talks about problem solving coping versus emotion focused coping. So like what we would think of as therapy as like learning to deal with your situation, learning to deal with your emotions, etc., versus what she more advocates for in like this decolonial liberation paradigm as problem solving coping, which she explicitly includes confrontation. So she has activism and, quote, resistance. Keep in mind that like in a Marxist context and like this kind of context, resistance usually includes violent resistance. Like Hamas would be resistance. And then explicitly includes confronting the people like responsible. Let me see if I can get the confronting the persons perpetrating the stress and trauma of oppression. So like in this context, that's a very like a really serious little sentence that's just sort of like hidden in there. That like it's therapeutic to do resistance and like confrontation in a decolonial sense.
So I came across a video recently, after we had discussed kind of scheduling this discussion and stuff like that, that I think illustrates the I guess the worldview, or this, yeah, I guess what, this France Fanon's kind of worldview, and this whole violence of decolonization mindset. And as a matter of fact, I just said violence and decolonization. That is, James Lindsay on New Discourses actually has a podcast titled The Violence of Decolonization, right? So I'll probably link that as well, because just to emphasize the point. But like I said, I came across this video. It's about a minute and a half long, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and play it. We'll just kind of listen to it, and then you can mention your thoughts or whatever after it. But I think this kind of illustrates that mindset and that worldview, pretty clearly. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'll play this now.
One way black people achieve true liberation, that's by taking it in blood. There has to be blood all over the floor. There has to be bodies on the floor. There has to be people screaming and crying. That is the reality. And this is what history shows me. No amount of begging, no amount of complaining, no amount of protesting, nada is going to get you your liberation until you take it with blood. You see? So this is why I sit back and I don't play along with any of these black people talking about it's a spiritual war, this, that, because when those cops are going into our neighborhoods and shooting our babies, that's a physical thing. You see, y'all so worried about the spiritual world, and all, but you're not worrying about the world that's right in your face. When we're getting thrown in prison, that's a physical thing, right? Address the physical. You see, this is why I say don't hit my phone until y'all ready to do what y'all know we got to do. When y'all ready to go outside and hunt them white boys, hunt them cops, go to that white boy's neighborhood and get shit up. When y'all ready to do what y'all know we got to do, hit me. But until then, I'm not playing around with y'all, because it's all of these excuses for why we don't want to do it. Why? Many of us are scared. You know what I mean? Many of us are complacent in our oppression. Many of us don't want to burn the relationships we have with white people, all of these things. So I'm going to sit back and do my thing. When y'all ready to go outside and take blood, hit me anytime. But you see, a lot of us are not ready to do that. But I'm trying to tell y'all, there is no freedom. There is no liberation for our people until there's blood on that floor, on that battlefield. And that's the truth we don't want to admit.
So, I mean, like I said, I just think that kind of illustrates pretty much everything that you were just talking about, in that clip. And for anybody who's thinking, this stuff that you're talking about is some academic nonsense or some fringe, lunatic group of people that are whatever. I mean, this is people are absorbing these ideas. He might not even know where they're coming from, where they've originated from. But people are absorbing these ideas because these ideas are being put out there as part of this revolution, to destroy the West, to destroy, America. So anyway, look, I just wanted to show that,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, and like that's why this is so important to me, because that, like what we just saw right there, that is sort of, I mean, honestly, that is the end, like, consciousness of a lot of these practices that are being done on psychologically vulnerable people. So, you're taking somebody in a therapeutic context and trying to empower them, like, so that they would perceive it as like being like that is psychological health, because he's not like, he's not accepting the various systems of power that are oppressing him. So he's not like internalizing the oppression, things like that. But, I'm aware that it's difficult for people to process that, like, this is really happening, because it is crazy. It is absolutely insane. Like what we just saw is like basically like Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth in like a little clip. And this, that book is cited in the mainstream academic literature and like counseling and things like that. And so like if that clip were like, in the counseling literature, like people would immediately understand that it's insane. But like it's sort of just like obscured in all these books that like no one reads, and everyone like it's hidden under all these layers so that people don't realize that like we're talking about something as explicit and serious as this. And like that's why I've put so much effort into like this piece, why I know that like I'm having to say things that are like quite serious, and that like is not only controversial in certain ways, but like I am like putting myself out there in a way that like I have absolutely no desire to do, because I know where this is headed, and like I know it's like these are psychologically vulnerable people being used to facilitate it. And like that is just so messed up in like so many different ways. And the consequences of it are going to be quite serious, not only for, you know, the public and the people who have been harmed by therapy, but like, no, like therapy is going to collapse. So anyway, just my 2 cents.
No, 100%, 100%. If you think this is a good time to kind of segue into, I mean, basically how all of this background information that you've presented so far, you know, is kind of coming together and presenting itself. I know you know, in your essay, you got into like, you know, the 21st century context and, you know, as below, so above, and those aspects of the activism on the ground and the let's say the agendas coming from, you know, kind of international organizations, you know, I mean, the United Nations and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, you know,
yeah.
So this is kind of where, you know, all of this stuff that we've been talking about, you know, is happening now. It's coming together now and coming into society, coming onto the world stage for what they have planned. What they have planned next in their revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like I understand that that's a lot of background, and that's like me cutting it as minimal as I can, but I want to make it as comprehensive for people to be able to understand just the nature and how this is operating, especially in like a liberation context, so they can identify it. But you know, let's like all this stuff has been like, for example, like in the academic journals for a long time, you know, so like all the crazy stuff, decades in counseling, social work, psychology, things like that. But it's after 2020, I'd say, when after George Floyd, it became like a thing to sort of like, you know, all these professional organizations and, you know, basically the professions they represent started self-struggling to like rid themselves of their racism. And it just opened the door for like so much insanity. So, you know, I mean, there are in total, if you add all of them together, I think it's like 1 million mental health professionals in the United States. I have no idea what the number is since like maybe 2018 to 2020, where like things really started kicking off, where it became more mainstream. But like, you know, so we're talking about something that like maybe 30 years ago was just in like a radical psychology journal, is now in the American Psychologist, the flagship, you know, academic journal for the APA, is considered completely ethical and in fact like the highest level of cultural competence, like social justice and cultural competence, that kind of thing, the highest level of it. And so you have like real radicals that have professional licenses, access to vulnerable, psychologically vulnerable people in a context where like you have power over them. I know, like especially like in counseling, people really push like the Rogerian card a little bit, but like in reality, you have authority in like a lot of different senses over your, you know, your patient or your client, even if you like you're not necessarily being able to control them, but you can control things like diagnosis, the kind of treatment that they receive, all of those kinds of things. So you have real radicals with that kind of power dispersed throughout the United States. It's like a very serious situation. And so like, you know, on the topic of diagnosis, for example, I didn't really get into it, and I don't think I will too much, but it's called, there's a concept within decolonial, like decolonization in general, called indigenous ways of knowing. Sometimes you'll see it as IWalk. Like I'm thinking, for example, of that, the feminist glaciology paper, like that, for example. Have you ever heard that podcast where James, I think it's like What Radicalized You, James Lindsay?
Oh, absolutely. Hilarious. Yeah. I mean, it's hilarious on one, it's hilarious to me, but it's also like insane, completely insane.
But like, so it's basically like taking, and this is like a very Marxist thing to do, is taking, so like the objectivity of science is oppressive in like various senses. So it tries to combine like the objectivity of science with like the subjectivity of lived experience. So, like the synthesis of subject object should be like a flag for people. But basically it's like, and somebody gave me this idea on Twitter, so I can't take credit for it, but like in the context of diagnosis, it's like critical psychopathology theory or like critical personality disorder theory, basically like taking critical theory and applying it to diagnosis. And so like the most stigmatizing diagnoses, I'm thinking, for example, like various schizophrenic disorders. I'm thinking of borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. Both of those personality disorders are in this like cluster B framework that I talk a lot about, but like a core feature of that would be like emotional instability, emotional volatility. I think people would consider borderline to be more like feminine, maybe like the feminine orientation of that instability, versus antisocial personality disorder would be like, you know, like your men in Antifa, like just raging on the streets, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But they're both kind of in this emotional and like unstable frame, but like they're very stigmatizing diagnoses. So you're empowered in this context to not give them to the people that you know, like need them in order to get like the proper treatment. They use like pseudo diagnoses like intergenerational trauma. So like some trauma that like your grandfather experienced is yours, that kind of thing. Post-colonial stress disorder. So like that's, you know, like instead of doing a PTSD diagnosis, it's like post-colonial. And these are not like in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used for diagnosis from the American Psychiatric Association. But like these are like pseudo diagnoses. And a lot of times people like in the context of professional therapy will like talk about it, but like not like officially diagnose in that kind of sense. The colonial soul wound, that's another one that comes from Dr. Jennifer Mullen, who describes herself as the quote rage doctor, who's alchemizing people's rage, like 15,000 red flags in like the decolonial context. But so like that kind of stuff's going on. We also have like it's by like this indigenous ways of knowing in the context of counseling and psychology has opened the door up to like all these wild, like absolutely wild practices. I've seen ads for this on like, you know, like regular like public ads and things like this. It's definitely happening. And just from kind of like being, because I went to NYU, so like I was in, you know, I was not physically there, but I, you know, in classes and things like that, I engaged with people in the tri-state area, kind of got a vibe for the culture and things like that. And like this stuff is totally considered normal. Like the Afro-Indigenous, like syncretic witchcraft, basically. So like doing things like communing with ancestors, you know, doing like, and we're talking about in a therapy room, in a professional, like licensed professional therapy room with somebody who's psychologically vulnerable, doing like communing with their dead ancestors to receive, you know, this like wisdom of, you know, like maybe they are African American, and so they had ancestors who were slaves, and so like they commune with this ancestor, and this ancestor gives them, you know, the impetus to, you know, do revolution against the colonizing powers, like that kind of thing.
I saw an interview with some founders of BLM, and I wish I had it to play, because they literally were talking about like you said, talking with their ancestors or whatever. I mean, the same type of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, but go ahead.
But exactly. So like I'm not talking about, I mean, it is obscure in like a literal sense, but like it's not that obscure. We're talking a lot of people, and especially like in certain cultures and things like that, it's considered a little bit more normal. So like I use the Afro, you know, indigenous kind of like, because you know you have a lot of that kind of like specific immigrants in like say the tri-state area. But like you can do like, this is anything you want to do. I've seen it in like an Asian context. There's no limits. They're just going to exploit whatever like demographic or cultural characteristic they can that's in front of them. The Association of Black Psychologists also does these. They're called Sawubona healing circles. Sawubona means I see you, and they're rooted in Ubuntu, I am because we are, which is like a African proverb that, like in my mind, the first thing that comes to mind is Paulo Freire's the I exist does not precede the we exist, but is fulfilled in it. So like that social ontology that I was talking about from Marx, like literally like we are social beings in like a really pure sense of the word. But like, so like Kwanzaa, that kind of thing. So like taking like quote unquote African centered, culture things, which like means almost nothing, and using it as like a way of pushing collectivism and all these like resistance and things like that.
Right. Okay. Okay. Um. So I know you started getting into like how this affects the diagnosing, and you talked about it, a little bit just a few minutes ago. How patients are diagnosed and how things are reported. You know what, I had a clip. I just wanted to see if I could. It's a quote from your. Let me see here. Well, this is related to the kind of the indigenous knowledge that you were just talking about. This piece here from your essay. It says, importantly, this is an explicitly decolonizing, integrative, psycho-eco-cultural intervention grounded in the idea that disconnection, or lack of communism, almost what you were just saying in terms of being a social, being,
Mm-hmm.
that grounded in the idea that disconnection is the central driver of psychological disorder, and thus reconnection drives healing. So I mean that's this is directly from your essay, right? So I mean, obviously
Yeah.
this, you wrote this, but it really corresponds with exactly what you said in terms of that social being, and when they mean social being, I mean that connection with socialism, or that connection with communism, basically.
Yeah, so this is in reference to something called Sankofa psychotherapy. I learned about this from Dr. Tama Bryan's presidential paper that I referenced at the beginning. So it's like a, I don't know, it's like a new intervention strategy. I guess I don't know how new it is. I haven't heard too much about it, but like they use things like the Sankofa sevens, seven wisdoms. Of course, seven is like a symbol of wholeness in a lot of contexts. But anyway, so like that's like one of those kinds of interventions that are being used. It's just something really briefly to touch on in the context of diagnosis is also reporting. So like as you might expect, the people that hate the police aren't like too keen to call the police, even when they really need to. So like we are mandated reporters. If I have like, real reason to believe that like, like somebody is going to commit a violent act, or if they're going to harm themselves, we are like mandated to intervene. But if you perceive that as like involving the police or like the state in a problematic kind of way, you are significantly less likely to fulfill those duties. And I'm so sure that it's happening all the time, because I mean I've seen literally public therapy ads that will say like, no, I won't call the police. So like let's like put this into like a picture where we're talking about psychologically vulnerable people who are exposed to like, maybe they're exposed to critical pedagogy, they're like K through 12 education. It's in the culture, it's like basically everywhere. Then they go see a therapist. The therapist is empowered professionally and ethically and legally, I should say, to do consciousness raising. And like when I say legally, I want to emphasize that like that's, I think, an avenue to where we can perhaps like interfere with this, because it probably should not be legal to do consciousness raising on psychologically vulnerable people. This is a Marxist cult. It's going to end poorly. It is not okay to do this on people. But sorry, I got distracted
No,
from my
no, that's fine.
the big picture. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So basically I'm trying to emphasize that we're talking about people that are pushed in like all the like pushed in this way in so many different contexts: online, in person, in schools, in their therapy room. In the therapy room, it's like private. You're behind, like you have confidential access to somebody in like a very vulnerable sense. So like we're talking about people's like deepest thoughts and fears and emotions, and it's a really serious role. So giving that role to people who are basically activists who think it's totally okay, think it's actually healing to basically induct or recruit another person into this cult through therapy, so that they can do revolutionary activism and like basically martyr themselves for the revolution. That's what this is. So we're talking about like using therapy to create martyrs. It's so it's so mind-blowing to me. I've written this whole thing. I've been working on this for a really long time, and like even I still can like barely like keep it in my mind because it's so insane. But like that's literally what's happening.
And
So I just want to emphasize how serious this is.
yeah, for sure. And then, as you mentioned as well, like this is all happening behind a wall of confidentiality that like makes it hard to penetrate and to raise awareness about, and to to even know that it's happening.
Mhm.
So that's a whole nother aspect of it.
And people are not above like fudging notes and things like that, or like maybe just like making them vague, leaving things out if people feel like they're under attack. Like for example, like like this is important because not only am I putting this in the context of like the quote unquote material term where there's going to be more of a focus on economic and like those kinds of issues, but also in the context of the return of Trump, which I know like for the average person listening to this, they might not like fully recognize how like serious that is to a lot of people. Like they perceive it as like an existential like fascistic, like this is it, like you're empowered to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do to fight back against Trump because he's that serious of a threat, like Trump and like Elon, I guess now. So in that context people feel empowered. So like you see it all the time in the context of like transitioning people. Like they'll fudge notes and say like a doctor, for example, will put like a endocrine disorder instead of like gender dysphoria or something like that. Like they'll kind of fudge diagnosis. Like that's the kind of thing, because these are people who they feel like reality is not like reality is something that you like socially and critically construct. So lying is not like if you're fudging things against like an oppressor, you're actually doing something just in their mind. So we're talking about like a very it's an out of control situation because it's I mean, unless you're going to do like a inquisition or something, like it's going to be very difficult to address it. The only ways that I can think of are like making conscientization and like radicalization in this context, like in therapeutic profession, like licensed professional therapeutic context, illegal, and actually like acting upon that when there is like solid evidence that that's happening. But like you're still going to have people going underground, fudging things, using confidentiality. Like it was a huge mistake to let all of these people into the field in the first place, and there are going to be consequences to that.
For sure. I wanted to bring up this one piece from your essay as well, and it's related to the diagnosing and the reporting aspect of it. And it's and you kind of just touched on this with what you're just saying, right? It says, thus decolonial and liberation psychologies not only make it more likely that those who are seriously mentally ill are not getting adequately diagnosed and treated, but also provide an opportunity to abuse the appearance of authority as a licensed clinician to present the Marxist cult conspiratorial idea that systemic oppression is the cause of one's issues and that participating in the revolution is the only way to resolve them. Like, I'm just going to read that last part again because that's like, this is kind of like the root of it here, right? The idea that systemic oppression is the cause of one's issues and that participating in the revolution is the only way to resolve them. That's like, yeah, that's insane that patients are being looked at that way, are being treated that way.
Yeah, and so like if you're depressed, if you're experiencing stress, say like you're experiencing stress related to your job or something, that can be pivoted into capitalism. Or you experience like a racial incident, whether real or perceived. That could be pivoted into racism, which is connected to sexism, which is connected to capitalism. So basically anything can just be reoriented to revolutionary activism. And like there are so many different like specific clinical practices that I included in the piece. I won't get into all of them, but I like mostly included them for other clinicians because I think it's useful to know. And this is just like a warning that I want to provide to people like specifically in the psychotherapy field, whether it's in counseling like me or in psychology, social work, whatever. Like, do not participate in this because we've already seen like this is obviously not okay. It's maybe not legal. It might not be legal already. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really like navigate or adjudicate that. But like don't mess with it because you like just because the ACA said it was okay is not gonna like stop you from getting sued. So and that's like one of the ways of like preventing it too is like stigmatizing it so that nobody wants to do it because right now people feel really empowered to just do this and because there's not really any consequences, but making it stigmatized and actually enforcing whatever ethical or legal methods that already exist I think is really important. But like I'm going to use for example the trans issue again because like I think people find it difficult to believe that like these that this would like influence violence or like encourage violence, like whereas we've already seen like basically violence against the body of children. I mean the bodies of children, bodies of adults, like transitioning is a very violent, like physically violent act against the self. So that's already happened. And we're also seeing like that was completely endorsed by all the various professional bodies and considered totally normal. And it's not stopping some of these doctors and practitioners from, consequences and lawsuits and things like that. So just keep that in mind that you don't want to go down this route because it's not going to end well. Like eventually reality is going to smack us in the face and you don't want to be involved in this when it does.
Big time. One thing I wanted to ask you about, but before kind of we get into any like aspects of or any recommendations that you might have for people who are seeking therapy themselves or for a friend or family member or trying to help somebody out find some counseling type things like that. I wanted to ask you about the kind of this recovering historical memory piece and what you refer to as like the virtues of the people. Is that something that you could like just expand on a little bit and but go ahead.
Yeah, so those are concepts that come specifically from Ignacio Martin Barro's liberation psychology, so like this OG liberation psychology, so recovering historical memory. And it's being used now to like be clear. It's not just in the past, but it specifically comes from that. But it's basically like this consciousness raising. So being able to examine current structures of power and privilege and whatever, and identifying ways in which like colonization or oppression has like basically rewritten history. So I'm thinking, for example, of the 1619 Project. Like that would be a good example of like, quote, recovering historical memory. So it's in like a collectivist Marxist kind of sense. So it's done, and like of course it's presented as denaturalization or like ideology. I can't say that word. Ideology, like ideologyizing.
Okay.
So it's presented as basically like not like it's an inversion of what it is because of course it's like completely like ideology. Like this is like a very Marxist thing. So like Marxists would say like everyone else has ideology except them. Like they're the only ones that are like free of ideology. So it's like that kind of thing. But like it's basically like so freeing clients of like this quote cultural stranglehold of like the imprisoning social structure and allowing them to recover their quote authentic self. In the piece, I specifically mentioned the 1979 revolution, and I think this ties back into Ali Shariati, and like the Shia, like being this basically, like, that was a tactic that was used in order to facilitate the 1979 Iranian revolution, was through sort of like, like emphasizing that Shia are always oppressed, and like what was your history before your oppression, like that kind of thing. So that Shiism is like, naturally a revolutionary, Islamic kind of sect, basically, like that kind of thing. So it's highly, I mean, it's been used. It's constant, like it's definitely an effective means of sort of raising consciousness and sort of like creating this like fantasy of like, oh, what things were in the past. And I'm kind of emphasizing more of like a leftist context, but like you could do this with like what people would call the woke right, oh, before the post-war liberal consensus, the magical time of XYZ. So like it's not just like there's basically you can radicalize somebody into any direction depending on like what you are targeting, or like what their particular like exploiting or exploitative things that you can exploit within them. And then with respect to virtues of the people, this is also from Martine Barrow, and it's basically like it hides behind strengths-based language and like resilience and empowerment and things like that. But like they're virtues of like the proletariat. Like what would be a virtue of the proletariat from a communist perspective would be like courage to resist oppression, solidarity, faith that they can change the world and that this imminent kingdom of God can come into reality, hope for their quote tomorrow of freedom, things like that. So basically like communist virtues that are like ascribed to people, like to the people. And in the context of counseling or psychology, it would probably hide behind like a strengths-based approach.
Okay. So when I read that, it reminded me of something I saw in years ago now. I don't know, 5-6 years ago now, with culturally responsive education and the asset-based approach versus the deficit-based, right? And so what I want to do is I just want to bring a slide up real quick, just to show you what I came across. Literally, I mean, it was 5 or 6 years ago when I was, really getting into the education stuff and learning about it. So this is an article that was written by some of the authors of the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. Okay. It's called Prioritizing Mindsets, What New York State's CRSC Framework Gets Right. And obviously it's from some of the authors. They're trying to promote it, and they want people to believe, what it gets right here. I know the words are very small. I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger, and I'm gonna read it for people here. But I just want to go through this and what we were talking about earlier in terms of once you understand like the underlying operating system of this stuff, it's all the same. Like Katie was saying, in terms of it's just contextualized in different areas, whether it's education, whether it's psychology, mental health care, whether it's the healthcare system, whether, whatever it is, it's the same underlying thing. So let me just blow this up a little bit bigger. So, and I'll read it for everybody. So CRSC, Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education, does not buy into gaps. And when it's talking about gaps, it's talking about like achievement gaps or performance gaps between students. And in this case, they're talking about like, groups of students, let's say, identity groups of students. So CRSC does not buy into gaps because it disrupts the premise of achievement, exchanging deficit views of students, meaning that the students are not, sufficiently knowledgeable for whatever reason. Either they, not putting the effort in, not showing up to class, or for whatever particular reason, right? So exchanging deficit views of students with placing students as both the starting and ending places of learning. So, so in that, just reading that one part, placing the students as both the starting and ending places of learning, that's like ridiculous. But that's kind of the whole point. They think the students already basically know what they need to know. They don't need to learn, let's say, westernized education. They they should be the start. What the students already know should be the starting, and they should have the final basically the final say. They should be the ending places of learning. It says when inequities arise, culturally responsive sustaining education names them what they are: racism, cis heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, white supremacy, and ableism, viewing the challenges we face in education as historical as opposed to individual. Right? Exactly what you were basically just saying. And I'll just read this last couple sentences here. The theory of change that a deep study of culturally responsive sustaining education offers teacher A. They were comparing teacher A's approach versus teacher B's approach in this article. The theory of change that a deep study of culturally responsive sustaining education offers teacher A begins with the transformation of their mindset from a deficit mindset to a humanizing one. So, whatever, if there's some type of gaps or some type of deficiencies that the student has in their learning, it's not because of the student. The student has no responsibility whatsoever. It's because of, let's say, institutional problems or structural problems. With a CRSE lens in place, teacher A can begin to shift their practices and ultimately redefine student outcomes. This radical transformation occurs by locating the problem away from the students and their cultures and placing it on institutional mindsets, practices, and policies. So, like, this is what we were talking about. I mean, and
Mhm.
it's I mean, the same words, the same concepts, the same ideas, only this is an education context. And it's been, as we've been trying to raise awareness for years about the problems with culturally responsive education, that's driving a lot of that's the main driver of this into education. It's called ethnic studies, kind of on the West Coast, but I think that's starting to make its way around. But it's basically the same things, just different names. And then obviously the social and emotional learning programs are bringing a whole nother aspect. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of show that to you, and just because as soon as I saw that in your article, it just reminded me. It just jumped right out at me.
Yeah. Well, and like, note the humanizing language
Yeah.
that they used in there. So,
Go ahead.
like, this is why, like, when I was emphasizing, like, liberation theology is probably like the most important thing in our current context right now. Like, we're downstream of Paulo Freire, we're downstream of the Medellin conference, like all of this kind of stuff, because it's this kind of Marxism that's been channeled through a lot of the language of, and like the external ethos of Christianity and like especially Catholicism. That makes it very appealing to people, and especially like in the context of the US. So like people see humanizing and it's like a very appealing thing. I actually have a quote from the Medellin conference, the document from that, where it says, in Latin America, salvation, which is the realization of the kingdom of God, involves the liberation of all man, the progress of each man and all from a less human condition to one more human. So like being more human Like Paulo
Basically
Freire.
meaning social being, a species being,
Yeah,
a communist is
yeah,
basically what they're getting at in terms of being more humanizing, or a more human, uh, becoming by becoming a communist.
exactly. So I have a really quick quote from the Marx's Economic and Philosophic manuscripts of 1844. So these were like his early manuscripts. I think he was like in his mid 20s. So like some Marxists will kind of disregard them, but like Eric Voegelin, for example, I think he said that like reading the Economic and Philosophic manuscripts was where he realized that Marx was a Gnostic. But he talks about communism as the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e., human being. So when they say human, they mean communist, like Mark or what Paul just said. Sorry, I almost just called you Marx.
Carl, what was that? I can't remember. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but like, so that's like literally though. So that's what Paulo Freire means when he's talking about like humanizing education. And when you see that in like, this is New York State education, or, all these various contexts, we're talking about like Marxist theology. He even goes on to say like this communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. And this is also relevant, and we don't have to get into too much, but like because I mentioned the eco-theology thing earlier, and like basically we might call it like eco-Freireanism, or like, this like green Marxism, but like with this Freirean liberation theological bent to it. I mentioned Laudato Si, things like that. But like that's also an angle this is taking in counseling and psychology. I see a lot of programs. I see wilderness programs that are doing consciousness raising with people, and you can do like a lot of wilderness programs use like initiation, like rites of initiation and things like that. Which, in like a sane context of like, maybe a young boy or something like that, it's a completely different thing than what is like actually happening.
Sure.
Now it's like Mao's down to the countryside, like,
Yes.
sending kids off to go get radicalized in like a nature context. But like so like you can see how like this, resolving the conflict between man and man and man and nature. So you'd see why like in the context of climate change and like for the material turn sustainability, that and like degrowth and things like that, that like that's also basically the same exact thing that like we've been talking about. It's communism. Like when it comes down to it, this is communism. And I understand like maybe there are still some holdouts that like have not fully accepted that like communism is absolutely bound to fail. But like it's a really serious thing. If we start like practicing this worldview, there are going to be consequences. It's just absolutely unavoidable. And those consequences, and for like things like degrowth, economics, I mean, they're going to be serious. So this is something that people really, I think, should keep in mind.
So I just want to I'm going to bring up one last quote from your essay, which I think, obviously is whatever hits a main point here. And then after this, if you don't mind, just like I said before, maybe given your thoughts on if someone's looking for some counseling, or they know somebody who is, and they're hearing this, maybe they had no idea like that any of this was even going on, right? Whatever, but just your thoughts on maybe how they might navigate that. But I just want to kind of wrap up this part with this from your essay. It says, thus we can say with confidence that the mental health fields are using the professional role, including and especially therapy, to radicalize vulnerable people into violent, seditious, communist revolution. I mean, that wraps up like all of the stuff that you were talking about, all of that background information that people need to know about to even see that whatever it was, 1 or 2 sentences, and make any sense of, or even try to like believe at all. Because if you just saw that without understanding what's happening at all, you would think that's the craziest thing you've ever seen or heard. So anyway, I kind of wanted to, maybe kind of just wrap that part up with that quote, just to kind of like emphasize that's ultimately what's happening. And once again, like you said, it's happening, behind this wall of confidentiality, and which brings up a whole nother set of challenges. But so if someone is looking for counseling, or for themselves, or someone they know or whatever, do you have any kind of suggestions as to how they can navigate this stuff? Because I mean, listen, it's bad enough, kind of like just like the normal craziness. I should say the normal craziness, the craziness that maybe more people are aware of, that's happening in the mental health profession, right? That's bad enough. And then this here is a whole nother level. But obviously, it's all connected. It's all tied. This is basically the next phase, the next step of where it's heading. So how do you think someone maybe can navigate to some extent, if they're looking for some help?
Yeah. So, like the first thing that comes to mind is to just do your research, look at people's bios, like people advertise in Psychology Today, just read them. And if things really stick out to you as radical, just skip. A lot of times the bios will be so, like, people will advertise so explicitly that it's actually quite easy to kind of avoid some of them. Google, non-woke therapy, or ideology-free therapy, and like a lot of organizations will probably come up that might have places where you can contact them, and they can like send your information out to their group of clinicians that have joined, and like maybe you can get a referral through that. Definitely, like if you're looking for somebody for a kid, just like, once again, like do your research, whether like for yourself or for a loved one. You can usually do like a 15-20 minute consultation with a therapist, ask them questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're like in an intake, like ask it all the questions that you need to ask. They should be giving you a lot of information about informed consent. They should be giving you information not only about like possible benefits, but also risks. So if those things aren't happening, if you don't feel like you're getting adequate informed consent on, these kinds of practices that are happening on you, or being used on you, I should say, look for another therapist. I understand that, especially when you're in active distress, and like for certain mental health issues, like some of these are going to be more acute than others, and like maybe some of my recommendations aren't going to be appropriate. But like if you can, just look for a good fit, because like if you really need therapy, if you can find somebody that you can stick with through the course of your full treatment, and like really trust and engage with it, like it can make a difference. And like there is help out there. Like maybe one of the drawbacks and the benefits of therapy is that it is sort of like individualized. So there is like a little bit of free reign in terms of like the sane people are still just practicing as they always were. A lot of people are just ignoring a lot of the craziness, things like that. But yeah, just like, I don't want people to give up hope, because I understand like this is a really serious thing, and it's being pushed from these professional organizations. But like a lot of people aren't like, they don't care about the professional organizations. Maybe they get their like, it's more for like lobbying the states. Like those professional organizations do things like lobby the states for like various, for accreditation preference, or things like the counseling compact, things like that. But like a lot of that stuff is more targeted towards like the political realm than like the actual clinical realm of like things that people do in the day-to-day. So hopefully some of that helps. But yeah, I certainly want people to feel comfortable looking for a therapist, that there are people out there.
Right on. Thank you for that, because that's, especially after hearing, everything that's going on, it's definitely could be overwhelming, and it would be nice to, like you said, it does require some time and effort to kind of search these things out. But at the very least, people have to understand, that these things are happening in the mental health profession. And I mean, if you at least understand that going in, like, you're way ahead of probably a lot of people, because so many people I have to imagine are just going in and just getting blindsided by this, don't even understand, don't even know that they may be being manipulated by their counselor, whatever's going on.
Yeah. Well, and like,
So
it's
go
usually
ahead.
the most vulnerable, like psychologically vulnerable people that end up with these crazy counselors, because like a normal
Okay,
person's
sure,
not going to want to do it. So,
sure.
like a lot of times it's like really like materially, maybe they're getting like, some sort of like state BIPOC therapy fund or something like that. That like usually because of that, they'll emphasize like culturally responsive or like culturally relevant
Okay,
therapy. And so like in that, by that nature, it is usually like the most vulnerable people who end up with like the craziest radicalizers. um
okay.
it's a very unfortunate situation. I mean, truly breaks my heart to think of, like somebody struggling with a really like serious mental illness. They don't have a lot of options. Maybe they're homeless. Maybe they're like struggling with various material needs. And then this is kind of like what they get placed with. It's cruel. And I don't think it's, I think it's evil, frankly.
100%, 100%. I'm gonna put the link to your Twitter handle or X handle in the description. The link to your Substack in the description as well. Is there any other and probably, and definitely the link to a handful of things that we had talked about throughout the discussion. Is there any other links or anything? Well, you can let me know
Yeah.
either now or afterwards or whatever. But I'll put whatever links that you want in the description, so people know how to find you on Twitter, follow your work on Twitter, follow your work on Substack. Thank you very much for having this discussion with me. Like, you presented a tremendous amount of information. It's very important information. The work you are doing, and the awareness that you are trying to raise about this issue is huge. Is huge. And I hope more people engage with your work. I hope more people, talk to you about it, and and more people find out what's going on, because this is definitely happening. It's very scary, and this is where we're at. So
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It
appreciate it.
means a lot. And I mean, this topic, like it is absolutely so important. And I have like a sincere faith that, truth and justice will prevail in this, even if it doesn't happen tomorrow. Eventually this will be resolved.
That's a hope, no doubt, for sure. Well, thanks a lot, Katie.
Yeah. Thank you.